I used to trust Australians to do the right thing, and then I saw how we reacted to the asylum seekers.
And I've given you an explanation today as to why that happened and a model as to how we could fix it so it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, no. But hang on, your solution says let's get out of the convention and just adopt our own quota and the boats will stop coming. In other words, we won't have a problem of how to treat human beings who get here, whether we want them or not. That was the problem. I mean, we've got an offshore resettlement program. We're one of the small number of countries in the world that does. It has a modest quota, but it's a good thing. That's not the problem. The problem was that some other people were desperate enough to flee the Taliban and try and get into Australia for protection, and we treated them like animals. Now, what are you going to do?
Well,
I don't think your solution is going to mean that people will never try and escape to Australia.
Well, what happened, Julian, as you and I remember, is that after the Tampa, we had excising parts of the migration, the big island, Australia, out of the migration zone, so making it almost impossible to come to Australia and claim refugee status. So we've done lots of tricky things to avoid the convention, and we're not serious about it. I say, abandon it, but be genuine and generous as far as refugees are concerned.
Yeah, but hang on, Jeremy. I reckon this is escaping the real point. The real point is our willingness to mistreat human beings who, for one reason or another, we don't like. Now, it could be boat people, it could be Aboriginal people, it could be people with mental disabilities, homeless people, unemployed people, people who are suspected terrorists. It doesn't matter. Choose your unpopular group and watch how we behave towards them. And frankly, our track record makes me very sceptical about our capacity to act as good people should act. You know, if a government finds a political advantage in beating up on one small minority group, Australia seems willing to go along with it. How else did we tolerate the abandonment of David Hicks? How else did we tolerate the treatment of asylum seekers? How else could we be indifferent to the plight of the stolen generations or the treatment of Aborigines generally? You know, these are terrible human rights abuses in a country which has got so much going for it and full of people who are mostly good people. But good people can be persuaded to tolerate bad things.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah, sorry. I'd finished anyway, sorry. I get wound up.
Sorry guys, it's Marilyn. The right to asylum is enshrined in the Migration Act at Article 36, as our Masri's case showed, and everybody ignores. Laurie Ferguson just made a second reading speech about complementary protection, suggesting after 50, 60 years that maybe we should enshrine the rights of the child and stuff into the Migration Act and domestic law, as we are currently having Tamils locked up in Malaysia, Afghans locked up in Indonesia, and we are still deporting people to danger because we simply don't give a stuff about international law or even our own law. What is the guarantee that any Charter of Human Rights, without being in the Constitution, is going to protect any of the charters if they're enshrined in domestic law when nobody's protected under the Refugee Convention?
It won't guarantee the right result. What it does, though, is give you a toolkit that you can reach into. It allows you to talk about human rights in a court and be relevant. As I said before, you know, we were arguing all these human rights cases, but we couldn't talk about human rights. As for the Refugees Convention, it's only the test for refugee status that has been incorporated in the Migration Act. The rest of the obligations of the Refugees Convention have not been incorporated in domestic law, and we all know the consequences that happens. But it's an interesting point you raise, because we have signed all of these international conventions with good intentions, but we just don't seem to be prepared to take the next step and get serious about it by doing what we said we'd do.
Julian, you raised the point earlier that if a Human Rights Act is brought into effect, that just like any statute, it can be amended or repealed, and this would come at a political cost. Are Australians politically literate enough to give effect to that political cost, or would it be overlooked?
That's a fair question, and I think there's a risk it would be overlooked. Jeremy made the point earlier that if you don't like what the government is doing, you can kick them out at the next election. I think by the 2004 election, many members of the public had not only become aware of what was going on in detention centres, they'd begun to have some real concerns about it. That did not lead them to voting against the coalition government. I still think, though, that although there is the possibility that a future government might try to unwind human rights protection, it's better to have it and run that risk than not to have one at all for fear of losing it eventually.
I think we've got time probably for only one or two more questions. I know there's one down here, is that right? Yeah, thank you.
I'm just wondering if our government can make laws that contradict this Human Rights Act, yet you're saying that we can't trust Australians to do the right thing. How can we trust ourselves to stand up when the government does make this politically costly law against the Human Rights Act? It contradicts.
Yeah, I don't think I said we can't be trusted to do the right thing, but I think I understand the point of your question. And what I'd say is this. I think one of the reasons the Howard government got away with its mistreatment of asylum seekers was that it misrepresented the facts. It called them queue jumpers and illegals and so on. And when people came to recognise that we were locking up innocent people who had nowhere to queue, but who'd come here to save their lives, then we began to look at the government's conduct a little differently. If the Parliament introduces a Charter of Rights saying in parliamentary language, we acknowledge that these rights are important to a dignified existence in a free, democratic society, and if another government wants to abolish those rights, then there's no hiding from the fact that they are saying, we no longer think these rights matter. Now, the history of every other Western democracy that has human rights protection, and that's all of them apart from us, the history in those jurisdictions is that people become increasingly acculturated to the idea that human rights exist, that they are important in a free democratic society, and they become increasingly possessive about the idea of having those rights. So I think it would be politically difficult for a government to get away with the idea of simply trashing human rights once they've been acknowledged by an earlier parliament. Of course, it could happen. As a matter of legal theory, it could happen. But I think it becomes politically less and less likely as people come to understand that rights are important.
I think we were aware, though, that children were being held inappropriately and all those sorts of things were happening. But if a government's justifying what they're doing by saying queue jumpers and things like that, if they can use those sorts of tools now, they can use those sorts of tools even if they're in violation of a Human Rights Act. I don't think the Human Rights Act is going to stop them from using whatever justifications they need to do.
You might be right, and in my worst fears, you might be right. But does that mean we shouldn't even try to protect rights? This is the weakest, most modest form of protection of human rights. Even weak protection of human rights is better than none at all, and we just have to take the chance that this weak model will be enough to protect us and that another government won't try and take even that little protection away.
Can I just say that one of the problems with what was happening with the refugees issues at the time was that the Labor Party stood shoulder to shoulder with a lot of things that Howard wanted to happen. They were outmanoeuvred, and it makes it very difficult when you've got both sides of the major parties taking positions. My view is that if we're going to have this charter, it's like third best. It's not like a constitutional Bill of Rights, which is absolutely welded into the Constitution as basic rights.